Melissa Brown disappeared on October 12, 2002. For 7 years, police searched. Her mother never stopped looking, but Melissa never left the house. She was imprisoned in a secret room built by her own father, locked behind concrete in the family basement, writing in her diary that she could hear her mother crying upstairs. This is the true story of the hidden room on Maple Grove Drive. Before we descend into the darkness of this case, I need you to do three things right now. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me if you've ever discovered something hidden in your own home, and smash that subscribe button to Cold Crime Case, because what we're about to uncover will make you question every locked door you've ever walked past. The February wind tore through Cedar Rapids like a living thing, hungry and vicious, rattling windows and shaking the bare branches of oak trees that lined Maple Grove Drive. It was the kind of cold that went straight through winter coats and settled deep in your bones, the kind that made people hurry from their cars to their front doors without looking up, without noticing what might be watching from darkened windows. Inside the two-story colonial at number 42 Maple Grove Drive, Susan Brown stood perfectly still in the living room she'd called home for 17 years. Around her, the space looked different now, emptier somehow, with most of the furniture already moved out and only the heavy pieces remaining. The couch where Melissa used to curl up with her homework. The bookshelf Richard had installed crooked, insisting it looked fine even though books constantly slid to one end. The coffee table with the ring stain from that Christmas morning, when Melissa had set down her hot chocolate without a coaster, and Susan hadn't had the heart to scold her. Susan was 42 years old, though she looked closer to 50. 7 winters spent searching for her missing daughter had carved permanent lines around her eyes, pulled her mouth into a perpetual downturn, threaded silver through her dark brown hair. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been fuller, softer. Her hands had developed a tremor she couldn't control, especially when she was stressed, and they shook now as she watched Tom Henderson, the real estate inspector, move methodically through each room with his clipboard and flashlight. Henderson was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a gray beard and careful eyes. He'd been inspecting houses in Cedar Rapids for 23 years, and had a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. People joked that Tom Henderson could find a crack in concrete from 50 feet away, that he could sense structural problems the way some people could sense storms coming. Susan had hired him specifically because of that reputation. She needed to know everything about this house before she sold it, needed to be certain there were no surprises waiting for the new owners. She'd lived here long enough. Too long, probably. But leaving felt like abandoning Melissa somehow, even though her daughter had been gone for 7 years, even though the police had long since stopped actively investigating, even though everyone except Susan had accepted the most likely explanation. That Melissa had run away, started a new life somewhere far from Cedar Rapids, and simply didn't want to be found. But Susan knew better. A mother knows. Melissa hadn't run away. Melissa wouldn't have left without a word, wouldn't have abandoned her friends and her plans and her entire future. Something had happened to her daughter, something terrible, and Susan had spent 7 years trying to find out what. The house was quiet except for Henderson's footsteps moving overhead, the creak of floorboards, the sound of him opening and closing doors. Susan had already been through the first-floor inspection, standing silently while Henderson pointed out minor issues. Some water damage near a window, outdated electrical in the kitchen, a crack in the foundation that would need monitoring. Nothing major, nothing that would prevent a sale. She checked her watch, 2:15 in the afternoon. Outside, the sky was the color of old concrete, heavy with the promise of more snow. The weather forecast had called for another 4 to 6 inches overnight. Susan thought about the snow that had fallen the night Melissa disappeared, how it had covered everything in white, erasing footprints and tire tracks and any evidence that might have told them what happened. "Mrs. Brown," Henderson's voice echoed from somewhere below, muffled by the floorboards. Could you come down to the basement for a moment? Susan's stomach tightened. She'd been dreading this part of the inspection. The basement had always unsettled her, even before Melissa disappeared. It was unfinished, a maze of concrete walls and exposed pipes and dim corners that the single overhead bulb never quite reached. Richard had promised to renovate it when they first bought the house, had drawn up elaborate plans for a finished recreation room with a bar and a pool table. Like most of Richard's promises, it had never materialized. She crossed the living room and opened the basement door, flipping the light switch. The bulb flickered twice before staying on, casting weak yellow light down the narrow wooden stairs. Susan descended slowly, one hand gripping the railing, feeling the temperature drop with each step. The basement was always cold, even in summer, but in February it was like stepping into a walk-in freezer. Her breath misted in front of her face as she reached the bottom of the stairs. The basement stretched out before her, roughly 40 feet by 30 feet, with a low ceiling that made the space feel cramped despite its size. The concrete floor was painted gray, cracked in places where the foundation had settled. Along one wall, Richard's old workbench sat covered in dust, his tools still hanging on the pegboard above it exactly where he'd left them when he moved out 5 years ago. Cardboard boxes were stacked against another wall, full of things Susan couldn't bring herself to sort through. Melissa's childhood toys, old photo albums, Christmas decorations they'd never use again. Henderson stood near the far wall, about 20 feet from the base of the stairs. He was tapping his knuckles against the concrete in a rhythmic pattern, his head tilted slightly as he listened. The sound echoed in the cold space. Tab, tab, tab. Hear that? He asked without looking at her. Susan moved closer, her footsteps loud on the concrete. She listened as Henderson continued tapping, moving his hand across the wall in a horizontal line. Solid, 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 hollow. The change was unmistakable. Where the first 3 taps had produced a dull, flat sound, the fourth had a different quality, almost resonant. Henderson knocked again on the same spot, harder this time. There's a void behind this wall, he said, pressing his palm flat against the concrete. Maybe 3 feet deep, possibly more. That's not standard construction for a house built in 1985. Susan felt her pulse quicken. She stared at the wall, which looked identical to every other wall in the basement. Rough concrete, unpainted, with thin cracks running through it like spider webs. What does that mean? Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. Could be nothing, Henderson said, pulling a measuring tape from his tool belt. Old foundation settling, a sealed-off storage area. Houses this age sometimes have odd spaces where the architecture doesn't quite line up. He extended the tape measure, walking the length of the wall. But here's what's odd. He moved to the corner and began measuring the perpendicular wall, then walked the perimeter of the entire basement, calling out numbers that Susan didn't quite follow. When he was finished, he pulled a small notebook from his pocket and started scribbling calculations. After a moment, he looked up at her. The exterior dimensions of your basement don't match the interior. Based on the foundation measurements from outside, you're missing about 40 square feet of space. He walked back to the spot where the wall had sounded hollow and marked an X with chalk. Right about here. Susan stepped closer, reaching out to touch the cold concrete. Her fingers trembled as they made contact with the wall. 40 square feet. That was the size of a small bedroom. The size of Melissa's walk-in closet upstairs. Richard did some work down here back in 2001, she said quietly. Said he was reinforcing the foundation after we had that flooding issue. It had been a wet spring that year, unprecedented rainfall that had overwhelmed the city's drainage systems and sent water pouring into basements all over Cedar Rapids. Their basement had flooded badly. 6 inches of standing water that had destroyed dozens of boxes and forced them to replace the water heater. Richard had insisted on doing the cleanup himself, had spent weeks down here running a dehumidifier and checking for structural damage. He'd told her the foundation had some cracks that needed to be sealed, that he was going to pour new concrete to reinforce the affected areas. Susan had been pregnant with their second child at the time, exhausted and uncomfortable in her 7th month, and she'd been happy to let Richard handle it. She'd barely come down to the basement during those weeks, content to trust that her husband knew what he was doing. The baby had been stillborn in July, a boy. They'd never even chosen a name. Henderson examined the wall more closely, running his flashlight along the edges where it met the floor and ceiling. The beam caught something Susan hadn't noticed before, a very faint seam, barely visible, running vertically down the wall about 3 feet from where Henderson had marked his X. "Mrs. Brown, see this seam?" He traced it with his finger, and Susan could just make out the line where 2 sections of concrete met. This section was poured separately from the original foundation. You can tell by the slight difference in color and texture. Someone added this wall deliberately. He moved his hand along the wall, pressing his palm flat against different sections, his expression growing more concentrated. "And unless I'm mistaken," he said slowly, "there's a door here. It's just been sealed with concrete facing." The words seemed to echo in the cold basement air. A door, hidden behind concrete, in the house where Susan had lived for 17 years, in the basement where Richard had worked alone for weeks while she rested upstairs, trusting him, believing his explanations about foundation repairs and structural integrity. "Can you open it?" Henderson straightened up, his expression uncertain. He looked at Susan, then back at the wall, then at Susan again. "I think we should call the police first." "No." The word came out sharp, surprising them both. Susan's voice echoed off the concrete walls, louder than she'd intended. She took a breath, trying to steady herself. "I've lived in this house for 7 years not knowing this was here." Her voice shook. "I need to know what's behind that wall, now." Henderson studied her face for a long moment. Whatever he saw there must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly and opened his toolbox. "It's going to take some time," he said, "and I'm going to need to damage the wall to access the door. If you want to sell this house, that's going to affect the price." "I don't care about the price." Susan watched as Henderson selected a hammer and chisel from his tools. He positioned the chisel at the edge of the seam he'd discovered and struck it with the hammer. The sound rang out, sharp and violent in the enclosed space. A small chunk of concrete facing fell away, revealing a thin gap behind it. Henderson worked methodically, chipping away at the concrete in a vertical line, following the seam downward. Dust filled the air, making Susan cough. She backed up a few steps but couldn't bring herself to look away. Every strike of the hammer felt like it was hitting her directly in the chest. Chip, chip, chip. The concrete facing was only about an inch thick, a cosmetic layer designed to blend the door seamlessly with the surrounding foundation. As Henderson worked, more of the seam became visible, and Susan could see that it formed a rectangle, approximately 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. A door-sized opening. After about 15 minutes, Henderson had cleared enough of the facing to reveal what he'd suspected. A steel door frame, professionally installed, with hinges on one side and a deadbolt lock on the other. The entire assembly had been painted gray to match the concrete, making it nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The door itself was solid steel, the kind of industrial-grade security door you'd see on a storage facility or a safe room. It had no window, no handle on the outside, just a keyhole for the deadbolt and a smooth, featureless surface. "This wasn't a DIY job," Henderson said, running his hand along the frame. "Professional installation, heavy-duty materials. This would have cost a few $1,000s minimum, and look at this deadbolt. It's a Schlage maximum security model, the kind they use in commercial buildings." He tried the door, pushing against it with his shoulder, but it didn't budge. The deadbolt was engaged, locked from the outside. Susan stared at the door, her mind racing. Richard had built this. Her husband had installed a secret room in their basement, hidden it behind concrete, locked it with a heavy-duty deadbolt, and never said a word. Not during their marriage, not during their divorce, not during the 7 years that Melissa had been missing. What was behind that door? Susan's hands were shaking so badly now that she had to clasp them together. She thought about all the nights she'd slept in the bedroom directly above this spot, all the meals she'd cooked, all the birthday parties and holidays and ordinary days she'd lived through while this door existed beneath her feet. She thought about Richard moving through the house with his easy smile, kissing her goodbye in the mornings, helping Melissa with her homework at the kitchen table. Had he come down here while they slept? Had he unlocked this door and stepped into whatever space existed behind it? Had he stood where she was standing now, in the cold basement at 3 in the morning, while Susan dreamed upstairs, unaware? "Mrs. Brown," Henderson said gently, "we need to call the police now. Whatever's behind this door, this is beyond a home inspection." If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about this case. But Susan was already moving past him, climbing the basement stairs 2 at a time. Henderson called after her, but she didn't stop. She knew exactly where she was going. In the kitchen, she yanked open the junk drawer, digging through batteries and twist ties and old receipts until her fingers closed around what she was looking for. A small ring with 3 keys. Richard's keys. He'd left them behind when he moved out, forgotten on top of the refrigerator, and Susan had tossed them in this drawer without really thinking about it. She'd assumed they were for his old truck or maybe the storage unit where he'd moved his things. She'd never looked at them closely, never wondered why he'd left them behind. Now she held them up to the light. 3 keys. 2 were obviously car keys, worn and scratched from years of use, but the third was different, smaller, newer, the kind of key that might fit a deadbolt lock. Henderson was waiting at the bottom of the basement stairs when she returned. His expression was troubled, but he didn't try to stop her as she pushed past him and approached the door. "Mrs. Brown, please," he said. "Let me call the police. Let them handle this." "In a minute," Susan said, "after I see what's inside." Her hand shook as she inserted the small key into the deadbolt. For a horrible moment, she thought it wouldn't fit, that she'd been wrong about everything. But then the key slid home with a soft click. She turned it. The deadbolt disengaged with a heavy metallic thunk that seemed impossibly loud in the silent basement. Susan's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her temples, in the tips of her fingers. She pulled the door open. The hinges moved smoothly, well-oiled, silent. The door swung inward, and beyond it was darkness, absolute and complete. The single basement bulb couldn't penetrate more than a few feet into the space behind the door. Henderson stepped forward with his flashlight, playing the beam across the hidden room. The space was larger than Susan had expected, maybe 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide. The walls were finished drywall painted white, with a concrete floor that had been covered with cheap vinyl tile. There was a twin bed against the far wall, neatly made with a faded blue comforter. A small bookshelf held maybe 20 paperbacks, their spines too far away to read. A folding table and chair sat in one corner. And along the right wall, Susan could see a bucket, a case of bottled water, and what looked like boxes of non-perishable food. The room was cold, colder even than the basement, and it smelled of concrete and something else, something musty and stale that Susan couldn't quite identify. The air felt thick, hard to breathe, as if it had been sealed in here for a very long time. Henderson swept the flashlight beam across every surface, and Susan found herself cataloging details with a strange, detached clarity. The bed had metal legs bolted to the floor. The bookshelf was similarly secured. There were no windows, no ventilation that she could see. A small camping lantern sat on the table next to a stack of spiral notebooks. and on the back of the door, mounted at eye level, was a whiteboard. Someone had written on it in black marker, the handwriting small and precise. Rules. 1. No crying after 9 p.m. 2. Keep this space clean. 3. Earn privileges through good behavior. 4. Remember that you are loved. Susan's knees gave out. She would have fallen if Henderson hadn't caught her arm, holding her upright. The flashlight beam wavered, casting wild shadows across the walls. "Oh my God," Henderson breathed. "Oh my God, Mrs. Brown, we need to get out of here right now. We need to call the police right now." But Susan couldn't move. She was staring at the bed, at the bookshelf, at the whiteboard with its neat, terrible rules. This was a prison. Richard had built a prison in their basement, had hidden it behind concrete and lies, had equipped it with a bed and books and food. Had someone been kept here? How long? When? The questions crashed over her like waves. She thought about all the times Richard had volunteered to stay home while she went out, all the nights he'd said he had work to do in the basement. She thought about the soundproofing he'd insisted on installing in the master bedroom after the stillbirth, claiming he wanted to make sure Susan could sleep without being disturbed by street noise. She thought about how he'd always been the first one up in the morning, the last one to bed at night. Henderson was pulling her backward, away from the door, his voice urgent in her ear. "Mrs. Brown, please, we have to go. We have to call the police. This is a crime scene. We can't contaminate it." Crime scene. The words finally penetrated the shock that had frozen Susan in place. She let Henderson guide her away from the door, back toward the stairs. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, disconnected from her body, moving without her conscious control. They climbed the stairs together, Henderson keeping one hand on her elbow to steady her. In the kitchen, he pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911, his voice calm and professional as he explained to the dispatcher that they'd discovered what appeared to be a hidden room in a residential basement, and that police needed to respond immediately. Susan sank into one of the kitchen chairs, the same chair where she'd sat thousands of times before, eating breakfast, paying bills, helping Melissa with homework. The room looked exactly the same as it always had: cheerful yellow walls, white cabinets, the refrigerator covered with old photographs held up by magnets, but everything had changed. The foundation of her reality had shifted, and she didn't know how to process what that meant. Henderson ended the call and looked at her with concern. "They're sending detectives," he said. "They'll be here in less than 10 minutes. Mrs. Brown, are you okay? Do you need me to call someone, a friend or family member?" Susan shook her head. She couldn't think of who she would call. Her parents were dead. Her sister lived in California and they barely spoke. Most of her friends had drifted away over the years, tired of her obsession with Melissa's disappearance, exhausted by her refusal to move on. "Richard," she said, her voice sounded strange, hollow. "We need to call Richard." Henderson looked uncertain. "Mrs. Brown, I think maybe you should wait and talk to the police first. They'll want to ask you questions, and they'll probably want to speak with your ex-husband themselves." "Where is he?" Susan asked. "Do you know where Richard is?" She realized she didn't actually know the answer to that question. Richard had moved out 5 years ago, after the divorce was finalized. He'd taken an apartment somewhere in Cedar Rapids, and for the first year or so he'd maintained regular contact, calling once a week to check in, sending occasional emails. But gradually the calls had become less frequent, the emails had stopped, and Susan had been too wrapped up in her search for Melissa to really notice his absence. The last time she'd spoken to Richard had been maybe 8 months ago. He'd called to tell her he was taking a job in Chicago, that he'd be moving there in a few weeks. Susan had congratulated him, hung up, and immediately forgotten about the conversation. Richard's life had become irrelevant to her, a closed chapter that had nothing to do with the only thing that mattered: finding Melissa. But now Richard's life was very much relevant again. Susan stood up, moving on autopilot to the small desk in the corner where she kept important papers. She pulled open the top drawer and found what she was looking for: a folder labeled divorce papers. Inside, among all the legal documents and financial settlements, was a sheet with Richard's contact information, a phone number, an address in Chicago. She picked up the kitchen phone and dialed the number before she could second-guess herself. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Richard's voice, unchanged from the last time she'd heard it. "You've reached Richard Brown. I can't take your call right now, but leave a message and I'll get back to you." The beep sounded. "Richard, it's Susan. I'm at the house on Maple Grove. I found the room, Richard. I found the room in the basement. The police are coming. You need to call me back right now." She hung up, her hand trembling. Henderson was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part concern, part horror, part something else. Pity, maybe. "Mrs. Brown," he said carefully, "your daughter Melissa. When did she go missing?" "October 12th, 2002, Susan said automatically. She'd said those words so many times over the past 7 years that they'd become a reflex, like her own name. She was 15 years old. She left for school that morning and never came home. Henderson's face went pale. He looked toward the basement door, then back at Susan. "Did your husband ever, was he ever considered a suspect?" Susan felt something cold settle in her stomach. The police questioned everyone. Me, Richard, Melissa's friends, her teachers. They searched the house, searched Richard's work, searched everything. They found nothing. No evidence of foul play. The detective in charge of the case, Detective Martinez, he told me that most likely Melissa had run away, that she'd probably turn up when she was ready. She'd hated Detective Martinez for saying that, had spent months arguing with him, insisting that he was wrong, that he didn't know Melissa the way she did. But eventually, as the months turned into years and no new evidence emerged, even Susan had started to wonder if maybe Martinez had been right. Maybe Melissa had run away. Maybe she'd had secrets, problems that Susan hadn't known about. Maybe their mother-daughter relationship hadn't been as close as Susan had believed. But now, sitting in her kitchen with the knowledge of that hidden room fresh in her mind, Susan felt a certainty settling over her like a weight. Melissa hadn't run away. Melissa had never left this house. The doorbell rang, making them both jump. Through the front window, Susan could see 2 police cars parked at the curb, their light bars dark. Henderson went to answer the door, and a moment later 4 people entered the kitchen, 2 uniformed officers and 2 detectives in plain clothes. The older detective was a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and sharp eyes. She introduced herself as Detective Sarah Chen. Her partner was younger, maybe 35, with dark skin and a concerned expression. Detective Marcus Webb. "Mrs. Brown," Detective Chen said, "we understand you've discovered something concerning in your basement. Can you walk us through exactly what happened?" Susan did, her voice steady even though her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She explained about the house inspection, about Henderson finding the hollow wall, about the measurements not matching up. She told them about Richard's foundation work in 2001, about the key she'd found in the junk drawer, about what they'd seen when she opened the door. The 2 detectives exchanged a glance that Susan couldn't interpret. "We're going to need to see the room," Detective Chen said. "And we're going to need you and Mr. Henderson to stay out of the basement until we've had a chance to process the scene. Can you both remain here in the kitchen?" Susan nodded. Henderson did the same. The detectives disappeared down the basement stairs, followed by one of the uniformed officers. The other officer stayed in the kitchen, positioning himself near the door, his hand resting casually on his belt near his radio. The minutes crawled by. Susan watched the clock on the microwave. 3:27, 3:28, 3:29. Outside, the sky was growing darker, the promised snow beginning to fall in fat, lazy flakes. Susan thought about the snow that had fallen the night Melissa disappeared, how it had covered the ground by morning, pristine and unmarked. At 3:42, Detective Chen emerged from the basement. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Susan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw was set. "Mrs. Brown, we need to ask you some questions. Would you be willing to come down to the station with us?" "Am I under arrest?" "No, nothing like that. We just need to get a formal statement, and we'll need to ask you some questions about your ex-husband and your daughter. It would be easier to do this at the station where we can record everything properly." Susan stood up. "Can I see the room again first?" Detective Chen hesitated. "I'm afraid that's not possible. This is now an active crime scene. We're going to need to bring in a forensics team, photograph everything, collect evidence. The basement will be off limits for at least several days, possibly longer." Crime scene. Evidence. The words made it real in a way that seeing the room hadn't quite accomplished. Susan felt herself nodding, heard herself agreeing to go to the station, watched herself gather her coat and purse as if from a great distance. In the police car, riding through the snowy streets of Cedar Rapids, Susan stared out the window at familiar landmarks made strange by context. The elementary school where Melissa had gone to kindergarten. The park where they'd fed ducks on Sunday afternoons. The library where Melissa had spent hours browsing the young adult section, coming home with stacks of fantasy novels that she'd devour in days. Had Melissa been in that room? Had her daughter been locked behind that steel door while Susan slept upstairs, while she called the police and filed missing person reports and hung flyers around the neighborhood? The police station was a squat brick building downtown, institutional and unwelcoming. Detective Chen led Susan through a maze of corridors to a small interview room with a table, 3 chairs, and a mirror that Susan assumed was one-way glass. Detective Webb joined them, carrying a digital recorder and a yellow legal pad. "Mrs. Brown," Detective Chen began, "I want to be very clear about something. You are not under suspicion. You are not being charged with anything. We simply need to understand the situation at your house, and we need your help to do that. You can leave at any time, and you have the right to have an attorney present if you want one. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Okay, let's start with your ex-husband, Richard Brown. When did you last have contact with him?" Susan thought back. 8 months ago, maybe 9. He called to tell me he was moving to Chicago for a new job." "What kind of work does Richard do?" "He's a civil engineer. He works for a construction firm, designing bridges and highways." "And before the divorce, what was your relationship like?" Susan didn't know how to answer that. How did you sum up 17 years of marriage in a way that made sense? "We were happy," I thought. "We wanted kids. We had Melissa, and she was perfect. We tried for another baby for years. I had 3 miscarriages before I finally got pregnant again in 2001. That baby was stillborn." Her voice cracked on the last word. Even after all these years, it hurt to talk about. The son who had never taken a breath. The nursery they'd prepared that had stayed empty. "I'm sorry," Detective Chen said, and she sounded like she meant it. "That must have been devastating." It was. Richard took it hard. He threw himself into work, stayed busy all the time. That's when he did the basement renovations after the flooding. He said it helped him to have a project, something concrete to focus on. Something concrete. The unintentional pun made Susan feel sick. Did Richard ever display any concerning behavior? Violence, controlling tendencies, anything that made you uncomfortable? Susan shook her head. "No, never. He was a good father to Melissa. He helped with homework, went to all her school events. When she disappeared, he was destroyed. We both were. The grief just ate us alive from the inside out. That's why we got divorced, really. We couldn't look at each other without seeing what we'd lost." Detective Webb had been taking notes. Now he looked up. "Mrs. Brown, I need to ask you something sensitive. When the police investigated Melissa's disappearance in 2002, did they search your basement?" "Yes, they searched the whole house, top to bottom, twice." "Did they find the hidden room?" The question hung in the air. Susan realized what he was asking. The police had searched, but they hadn't found the room, which meant either Richard had built it after Melissa disappeared or he'd done an exceptionally good job of hiding it. They didn't say anything about it, Susan said slowly. But if it was hidden the way I saw it today, if the concrete facing made it invisible, they might not have known to look for it. Detective Chen leaned forward. Susan, I need you to think very carefully about this next question. In October of 2002, when Melissa went missing, did Richard have any injuries? Any scratches, bruises, anything unusual? Susan closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember. October 2002, 7 years ago, a lifetime ago. Melissa had left for school on a Friday morning. Susan had been at work when the school called to say that Melissa hadn't shown up for any of her afternoon classes. By the time Susan got home, frantic with worry, it was after 3 p.m. Richard had already been there, having left work early when Susan called him. They'd started calling Melissa's friends, checking all her usual haunts, driving around the neighborhood looking for any sign of her. By evening, they'd called the police. The next days had been a blur of interviews and searches and waiting. Susan remembered Richard's face during that time, gray with stress, his eyes red from lack of sleep. She remembered him wearing the same clothes for days, refusing to rest, refusing to eat. Had there been injuries? I don't remember, Susan said finally. Those days are all blurred together in my memory. I wasn't paying attention to things like that. The detectives asked more questions, walking her through the timeline of Melissa's disappearance, Richard's behavior in the days and weeks afterward, the state of their marriage, the divorce proceedings. Susan answered as best she could, but she felt like she was describing someone else's life, events that had happened to different people. At 6:15 p.m., Detective Chen finally said they had enough for now. She gave Susan a card with her direct number and told her to call if she remembered anything else, anything at all, no matter how insignificant it seemed. What happens now? Susan asked. We're going to process the scene at your house. We're going to try to locate Richard and bring him in for questioning. And we're going to reopen the investigation into Melissa's disappearance. Susan felt tears burning behind her eyes. Do you think she was in that room? Do you think Richard kept her there? Detective Chen's expression was carefully sympathetic. We don't know anything yet, Susan, but we're going to find out. I promise you that. A uniformed officer drove Susan home. The house was blazing with lights, police vehicles crowding the street. Yellow crime scene tape had been stretched across the front yard, and neighbors stood in clusters on the sidewalk, watching and whispering. Susan saw Mrs. Patterson from next door, her face alive with curiosity. She saw the Johnsons from across the street, their teenage son holding up a cell phone, probably recording video. The officer escorted Susan inside but told her she couldn't stay. The house was now an active crime scene. She could gather some personal belongings, but she'd need to find somewhere else to sleep tonight. Susan packed a bag mechanically, clothes, toiletries, her laptop. In Melissa's room, she paused. The space had remained unchanged since the day Melissa disappeared. The same posters on the walls, the same books on the shelves, the same stuffed animals arranged on the bed. Susan grabbed Melissa's favorite sweatshirt from the closet, the gray one with the hood that she'd worn constantly in the weeks before she vanished. It still smelled faintly of Melissa's perfume, some cheap drugstore brand that every teenage girl seemed to wear. She checked into a Holiday Inn on the edge of town, a generic room that could have been anywhere. She sat on the edge of the bed and tried to call Richard again. Voicemail. She didn't leave a message this time. Her phone rang at 11:30 p.m., startling her out of a light doze. She'd been dreaming about Melissa as a little girl, maybe 6 years old, laughing as Richard pushed her on a swing set. Higher, Daddy, higher. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Susan answered. Susan, it's Richard. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, and hearing it now, in this context, made her feel like she might throw up. "Where are you?" she asked. "Chicago, I got your message. What's going on? What room are you talking about?" He sounded genuinely confused. Susan found herself studying his tone the way she might study a foreign language, trying to decode hidden meanings. "The police found a hidden room in our basement," she said. "Behind a false wall. A room with a bed and books and a whiteboard with rules written on it. A room that you built, Richard." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Susan thought he might have hung up. "Richard, I don't know what you're talking about." His voice had changed, gone flat and careful. "I never built any room. Are you sure about what you saw?" "I'm sure. I opened the door myself, with the key that you left behind." Another long silence. "I need to talk to a lawyer," Richard said finally. "Richard, please, just tell me the truth. Was Melissa in that room? Did you keep our daughter locked in our basement?" "I'm not saying anything else until I talk to a lawyer. Don't call me again, Susan." He hung up. Susan stared at her phone, her hands shaking so badly that she nearly dropped it. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the generic hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the room, the whiteboard with its rules: no crying after 9 p.m., keep this space clean, earn privileges through good behavior, remember that you are loved. Remember that you are loved. What kind of person locked someone in a basement prison and told them they were loved? The next morning, Susan's phone started ringing at 7 a.m. Reporters. They'd somehow gotten her number, and they all wanted statements, comments, interviews. Susan turned off her phone and sat in the dark hotel room, unable to face the day. Detective Chen called the hotel room's landline at 9 a.m. "Susan, we need you to come down to the station again. We've found some things we need to talk to you about." Susan's stomach dropped. "What things?" "It's better if we discuss this in person." At the police station, Detective Chen led Susan to the same interview room as before. This time, she was carrying a manila folder and an evidence bag. "Susan, we processed the hidden room overnight. We found quite a bit of physical evidence." She opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs. "I need to warn you, these are going to be difficult to look at." The first photograph showed the bed in the hidden room, photographed from above. Susan could see now what she'd missed in the darkness the day before. The metal frame was bolted to the floor, and there was a chain attached to one of the legs, a chain with a manacle at the end. The second photograph showed the bookshelf more closely. The books were all young adult novels, the kind Melissa had loved: The Giver, Harry Potter, The Hunger Games. The third photograph showed one of the spiral notebooks from the table, open to a page covered in handwriting. Susan's breath caught. She recognized that handwriting. It was Melissa's, the looping cursive with the exaggerated capitals that she'd developed in middle school and never grown out of. The notebook entry was dated November 3rd, 2002, 3 weeks after Melissa had disappeared. It read, "Day 22. Dad brought me chicken soup today and let me have the lantern for 2 extra hours because I finished all my homework. He says if I keep being good, he might let me have my CD player back. I miss music so much. I miss everything. But he says I'm getting better, that I'm learning. Mom still doesn't know I'm here. Sometimes I can hear her crying upstairs and it makes me want to scream, but I can't because of the rules." Susan made a sound she'd never heard herself make before, something between a sob and a wail. Detective Chen put a hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm so sorry." "Is there more?" Susan managed to ask. Detective Chen nodded. She flipped through more photographs, pages and pages of notebook entries spanning months. Melissa describing her days in the hidden room. Melissa talking about the lessons Richard made her complete, the ways she earned privileges or lost them. Melissa asking why this was happening, begging to be let out, promising to be better, to be good, to be whatever her father wanted her to be. The entries stopped in March of 2003. The final entry read, "Day 147, I don't feel good. My head hurts and I'm really hot. I asked Dad for medicine, but he said I'm faking to get attention. I'm not faking. Something is wrong. I'm scared. After that, nothing. Blank pages. We think she got sick, Detective Chen said. Probably an infection of some kind. Without proper medical care in those conditions, it would have been easy for something minor to become serious very quickly. Where is she? Susan's voice was barely a whisper. Where's my daughter? We don't know yet. We've brought in cadaver dogs. They're searching the property now, including the yard and the surrounding area. If Melissa is buried on the property, we'll find her. Susan thought about the vegetable garden Richard had planted in the backyard in the spring of 2003. He dug up a large section of the lawn, claiming he wanted to grow tomatoes and cucumbers. The garden had done poorly, the vegetables never really thriving, and after a year Richard had let it go back to grass. The garden, Susan said. Check the backyard where Richard's garden was. Detective Chen made a note. We will. Susan, there's something else. We've been trying to locate Richard. He's not at his apartment in Chicago. According to his employer, he called in sick yesterday and hasn't been heard from since. We've issued a BOLO, a be on the lookout order. Every police department in the country has his description and photo. We will find him. But they didn't find him. Not that day, or the next, or the day after that. Richard Brown had vanished as completely as his daughter had 7 years earlier. The cadaver dogs hit on the backyard garden on the third day. Forensic technicians carefully excavated the area, and 6 feet down, wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting and layers of tarp, they found the skeletal remains of a teenage girl. Dental records confirmed what Susan already knew in her heart. It was Melissa. The media descended on Cedar Rapids like locusts. Susan's face was on every news channel, every newspaper. The story had everything that the public loved in a tragedy. A missing girl, a hidden room, a father who'd kept his daughter prisoner in the family basement. Commentators debated endlessly how Susan could have not known, how she could have lived in that house for years without discovering the truth. Susan stopped watching the news. She stopped reading the papers. She moved through the days in a fog, meeting with detectives, answering questions, trying to piece together a coherent narrative from the fragments of her shattered life. The forensic analysis of Melissa's remains showed that she died of sepsis, likely from an untreated infection. The medical examiner estimated time of death as mid-March 2003, consistent with the final notebook entry. Richard had kept their daughter locked in that basement room for 5 months. And then, when she'd gotten sick and died, he'd buried her in the backyard and continued living in the house, continued sleeping in the same bed as Susan, continued going to work and coming home and acting as if everything was normal. Susan thought about all the nights they'd lain beside each other in the dark, talking about Melissa, wondering where she was, whether she was safe. Richard had held Susan while she cried. He'd helped her make missing person flyers. He'd attended vigils and search parties, all while knowing exactly where Melissa was. The divorce made sense now, Susan realized. Richard hadn't been able to bear the guilt of living with her anymore, hadn't been able to maintain the pretense. So he'd left, moved across the country, started a new life where no one knew about the daughter who'd gone missing or the wife he'd betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. 3 weeks after the discovery of the hidden room, a hiker found a body in a forest preserve outside Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The man had been dead for approximately 2 weeks, hanging from a tree branch, a suicide note in his pocket. It was Richard. The note was brief. I'm sorry for everything. I was trying to help Melissa. She was going down a bad path, hanging out with the wrong people, becoming someone I didn't recognize. I thought if I could just separate her from those influences, teach her the right values, she'd become the daughter I knew she could be. I never meant for her to die. I never meant for any of this. Tell Susan I'm sorry. Susan burned the note after the police finished with it. She didn't want Richard's apologies or his explanations. She didn't want to understand his twisted logic or know what he'd been thinking. Melissa was given a proper funeral 6 weeks after her remains were found. The church was packed with people who'd known her, people who'd searched for her, people who'd never met her but felt connected to her story. Susan sat in the front pew, staring at the closed casket, trying to reconcile the vibrant 15-year-old girl she remembered with the reality of bones in a box. Afterward, Susan stood at the grave site as they lowered Melissa into the ground. The March wind was cold, carrying the scent of coming rain. Around her, people she didn't know offered condolences and platitudes that meant nothing. When everyone else had left, Susan stayed. She stood beside the fresh grave, thinking about the daughter she'd lost twice, once when she disappeared, and again when Susan learned the truth about where she'd been. "I'm sorry," Susan whispered to the cold earth. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I'm sorry I didn't know." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, carrying no answer. Susan sold the house on Maple Grove Drive. She couldn't bring herself to live there again, couldn't walk through those rooms knowing what they'd contained. A developer bought it for a fraction of its value and immediately tore it down. The hidden room, the basement where Melissa had been kept prisoner, the backyard where she'd been buried, all of it reduced to rubble and carted away. Susan moved to Portland, Oregon, as far from Cedar Rapids as she could get without leaving the country. She changed her name, got a job in a bookstore, tried to build some kind of life from the ruins. But she never stopped thinking about Melissa. About the 5 months her daughter had spent locked in that room, hearing Susan's footsteps above, hearing her mother's voice calling her name while searching the neighborhood, being so close and yet completely invisible. Had Melissa hoped Susan would find her? Had she given up hope? Had she understood in those final days when the infection was ravaging her young body that her father wasn't going to help her, that she was going to die in that dark room? The questions haunted Susan's dreams. She saw Melissa in the hidden room, writing in her notebooks by lantern light. She saw Richard descending the basement stairs with a tray of food, unlocking the steel door, stepping into his daughter's prison with a smile on his face. She saw herself sleeping upstairs, blissfully unaware, while her daughter suffered and died below. 5 years after Melissa's funeral, Susan received a letter forwarded from her old address in Cedar Rapids. It was from a woman named Jennifer Holloway, who introduced herself as Richard's sister. Susan had met Jennifer only once, at Richard and Susan's wedding 22 years earlier. Jennifer had moved to Australia shortly after that, and the siblings had drifted apart. She wrote that she'd only recently learned about what her brother had done, and she wanted Susan to know how horrified and devastated she was. But there was more. Jennifer had been going through old family papers and had found something she thought Susan should see, a letter from Richard, written shortly before his death but never sent. Jennifer had included a copy. The letter was dated 3 days before Richard's body was found. It was 6 pages long, handwritten in Richard's neat, precise script. Susan almost threw it away without reading it. What could Richard possibly have to say that she would want to hear? But in the end, curiosity won out. She opened the letter. It began, "Dear Susan, I know you'll never forgive me. I don't expect forgiveness. But I need you to understand why I did what I did, even if understanding doesn't make it better." Richard went on to explain that in the summer of 2002, he discovered that Melissa was using drugs. Marijuana at first, but he'd found evidence that she was experimenting with harder things. He'd also found out she was dating a boy he considered dangerous, a 19-year-old dropout with a criminal record. Richard had confronted Melissa and they'd fought. She'd told him he was being paranoid and controlling, that he didn't understand her life. She'd threatened to run away, to drop out of school, to move in with her boyfriend. Richard had panicked. He'd convinced himself that Melissa was on a path to self-destruction, that she would end up addicted or pregnant or dead if he didn't intervene. So he'd come up with a plan. He'd started building the hidden room months before Melissa disappeared, working on it late at night while Susan and Melissa slept. He'd told Susan he was doing foundation repairs, and she'd believed him because she had no reason not to. His plan, he wrote, was simple. He would keep Melissa in the room for 6 months, maybe a year. He would homeschool her, keep her away from drugs and bad influences, help her see that she was making mistakes. He'd convinced himself it was a kind of intervention, a way to save his daughter from herself. On October 12, 2002, Richard had picked Melissa up from school using some excuse Susan couldn't remember. Instead of bringing her home, he'd taken her to the house while Susan was at work and locked her in the basement room. He genuinely believed he was helping her. He'd brought her meals, gave her schoolwork to complete, talked to her about making better choices. He'd set up the system of rules and privileges, thinking he was teaching her discipline and responsibility. But Melissa had been terrified, traumatized. She'd begged to be let out, promised to be good, to break up with her boyfriend, to stay away from drugs. Richard had told her she needed to prove she meant it, that she needed to complete the program he designed for her. He'd planned to find her after several months, to stage some kind of scenario where she'd been hiding out with friends or staying at a shelter. Susan would be so relieved to have Melissa back that she wouldn't ask too many questions, and Melissa would be too grateful to be free to reveal the truth. But then Melissa had gotten sick, and Richard had convinced himself it was just a cold or flu, something that would pass. By the time he'd realized how serious it was too late. Melissa had been unconscious when he'd last seen her alive. She died alone in that dark room while Richard had been upstairs, trying to decide whether to risk taking her to a hospital or to stick with his plan. The letter ended. "I know what I did was monstrous. I know I destroyed our family and killed our daughter. I lived with that knowledge every day for 7 years, and I can't do it anymore. I'm taking the coward's way out because I don't have the courage to face what I've done. Please know that I loved Melissa more than my own life. Everything I did because I loved her and wanted to protect her. That doesn't make it right. It doesn't excuse anything, but it's the truth. I'm sorry, Susan." "I'm so sorry, Richard." Susan read the letter 3 times, then burned it, just as she'd burned the suicide note. She didn't want Richard's explanations. She didn't care about his love or his intentions or his pain. But the letter had revealed something Susan hadn't known. Melissa had been experimenting with drugs. She'd been dating someone Richard considered dangerous. She'd been making choices that worried her father. Susan thought about the Melissa she'd known, a bright, cheerful teenager who'd seemed happy and well-adjusted. Had Susan missed signs that her daughter was struggling? Had she been so wrapped up in her own life that she'd failed to see what was happening with Melissa? Or had Richard exaggerated the problems, convinced himself his daughter was in crisis, when really she was just being a normal teenager testing boundaries? Susan would never know the answer. Melissa was gone, and Richard was gone, and all Susan had left were questions that would never be answered. 10 years after Melissa's funeral, Susan attended a support group for parents of murdered children. It was held in the basement of a community center in Portland. A dozen people sitting in a circle on folding chairs, drinking bad coffee and sharing their grief. When it was Susan's turn to speak, she found herself telling Melissa's story for the first time to strangers. She talked about the hidden room, about the notebooks, about Richard's twisted belief that he was saving their daughter. She talked about the guilt that ate at her every day, the knowledge that Melissa had been so close, that Susan had walked above her daughter's prison for months without knowing. An older woman across the circle, maybe 70, reached out and took Susan's hand. "It wasn't your fault," she said firmly. "None of it was your fault." Susan wanted to believe her, but late at night, alone in her apartment, she still heard Melissa's voice from those notebook entries. "Mom still doesn't know I'm here. Sometimes I can hear her crying upstairs." Her daughter had heard her crying, had heard Susan grieving for her while Melissa was alive and suffering just feet away. How could that not be Susan's fault? How could she have been so blind? The support group leader, a therapist named Dr. Martinez, pulled Susan aside after the meeting. "Trauma does strange things to our thinking," she said gently. "It makes us believe we have more control than we actually did. The truth is, Susan, your husband constructed an elaborate deception specifically designed to fool you. He took advantage of your trust. That's not a failure on your part. That's a betrayal on his." Susan nodded, but the words felt hollow. She'd heard similar things from other therapists, other well-meaning people who wanted to absolve her of guilt. But the guilt remained, heavy and immovable, a weight she carried every day. 15 years after Melissa's death, Susan received a letter from a true crime podcast producer. They wanted to do an episode about Melissa's case, to bring attention to the warning signs that parents should watch for, to discuss the psychology of family annihilation and imprisonment. Susan declined. She didn't want Melissa's story turned into entertainment, didn't want her daughter reduced to a plot twist in someone's podcast. But the producer persisted, sending follow-up emails explaining that they would handle the story with sensitivity and respect, that they would consult with experts, that they would honor Melissa's memory. Eventually, worn down and lonely and desperate to have someone remember that Melissa had existed, Susan agreed to be interviewed. The podcast episode aired 6 months later. Susan listened to it alone in her apartment, tears streaming down her face as she heard Melissa's story told by a stranger's voice. They'd done a good job, she had to admit. They'd been respectful. They'd portrayed Melissa as a real person, not just a victim. The episode went viral. Millions of people listened. Susan's inbox filled with messages from strangers offering support, sharing their own stories of loss and betrayal, thanking her for being brave enough to speak out. For the first time in 15 years, Susan felt like she wasn't alone in her grief. She started speaking publicly about Melissa's case. She gave talks at schools about warning signs of abuse and control. She worked with legislators on laws requiring better oversight of homeschooling situations. She turned her pain into purpose, using Melissa's story to try to prevent other tragedies. It didn't make the guilt go away. It didn't bring Melissa back, but it gave Susan a reason to keep going. 20 years after that February day, when Tom Henderson had knocked on a basement wall and discovered a hollow sound, Susan stood at Melissa's grave on what would have been her 35th birthday. The cemetery was quiet, peaceful. Susan had brought flowers, white roses, Melissa's favorite. She arranged them in the vase at the base of the headstone, which read simply, "Melissa Brown, beloved daughter, forever 15. "I'm sorry," Susan whispered, as she had so many times before. "I'm sorry I didn't find you. I'm sorry I didn't protect you." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, and Susan thought she heard an answer, faint and distant. "It's okay, Mom. I know you tried." Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was wishful thinking. But Susan chose to believe it was Melissa, finally offering the forgiveness that Susan had never been able to give herself. She stayed at the grave until the sun began to set, talking to her daughter about everything and nothing. About the life Melissa should have had, the future that had been stolen from her. About the things Susan had learned, the people she'd helped, the changes she'd fought for in Melissa's name. As she finally turned to leave, Susan made a promise to the cold stone marker. "I'll keep telling your story," she said. "I'll make sure people remember you, the real you, not just what happened to you. I'll make your life matter, Melissa, I promise." And she kept that promise. For the rest of her life, Susan Brown dedicated herself to making sure that Melissa's death meant something, that other children might be saved because of the lessons learned from her daughter's tragedy. It wasn't enough, it would never be enough, but it was all Susan could do. 23 years after Melissa's death, Susan Brown died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 65. Her obituary mentioned her advocacy work, the lives she'd touched, the changes she'd helped bring about in child protection laws. She was buried next to Melissa in the Cedar Rapids Cemetery, mother and daughter reunited at last. The headstone they shared bears an inscription that Susan had chosen years earlier: "Together again, forever loved, never forgotten." The house on Maple Grove Drive is gone, replaced by a small park with playground equipment and benches. There's a plaque near the entrance that reads, "Melissa's Garden, in memory of Melissa Brown and all children lost to violence." Children play there now, laughing and running through the space where a house once stood, where a hidden room once existed, where a girl once died calling for her mother. The laughter is healing in its way, a reminder that life continues, that hope endures, that even the darkest places can eventually be reclaimed by light. But those who know the history of that land sometimes pause when they walk past. They think about what was buried there, about the secrets hidden in plain sight, about how evil can wear a familiar face and hide in the most unexpected places. They think about Susan Brown, who lived for 23 years carrying the weight of knowledge no parent should ever have to bear. And they think about Melissa Brown, who died too young in the darkness, still hopping, still believing that someone would find her, that someone would save her. The wind moves through Melissa's garden, rustling the leaves of newly planted trees, carrying whispers of a story that should never be forgotten. A story about a hidden room in a basement. A story about trust betrayed and love corrupted. A story about a mother who searched for 7 years, never knowing her daughter was beneath her feet all along. This is where our investigation ends, but the questions it raises will haunt us forever. If this case has shaken you the way it's shaken me, I need you to do something. Hit that like button right now. Tell me in the comments what you think could have prevented this tragedy. And subscribe to Frozen Evidence Files Cold Crime Case, because there are too many stories like Melissa's that need to be told, too many victims who deserve to be remembered. Don't let Melissa Brown become just another forgotten name. Keep her story alive. Make sure we learn from this. And never, never assume that the people closest to you are incapable of unimaginable darkness. Stay safe out there, and thank you for bearing witness to Melissa's story with me today.